Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at washingtech.com/book. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washingtech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washingtech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Nationwide, police arrest individuals for threatening them on social media. The FDIC gets hacked, and Matt Wood is my guest. Naomi LaChance at The Intercept reported a spate of arrests for social media posts following the deadly shooting of police officers nearly 2 weeks ago in Dallas. Last year, the Supreme Court ruled in Alanis v. United States that police can arrest individuals for their posts on social media if reasonable people would view the post as a threat and the post was intended as a threat. Following the Dallas shooting, a Connecticut man wrote on Facebook that the shooter was a hero and called for other police to be killed. Another Detroit man was also arrested for saying the Dallas shooter was a hero. The Intercept covers a number of other incidents and analysis by legal scholars about the First Amendment implications of these arrests. A new House Science, Space, and Technology Committee report concludes that Chinese spies hacked into Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, computers for 3 years between 2010 and 2013, including personal computers belonging to then FDIC chairman, his chief of staff, and the general counsel. Why is this a big deal? Well, first of all, it's yet another example of the dismal lack of cybersecurity expertise at the federal government. But also, the FDIC was created in 1933 to prevent a recurrence of the thousands of bank failures that happened during the Great Depression. So yeah, it's not good news that somebody was able to hack into the FDIC and potentially mess with that. Jose Pagliari at CNN Money has more. California Congresswoman Jackie Speier introduced legislation last week to make sharing sexually explicit images obtained without proper consent, revenge porn, a crime. The bill is called the Intimate Privacy Protection Act. Speier said in a statement, quote, "Technology today makes it possible to destroy a person's life with the click of a button or a tap on a cell phone. That is all anyone needs to broadcast another person's private images without their consent," end quote. Hamza Shaban at BuzzFeed has full coverage. More than 140 tech leaders, such as the CEO of Slack and founder of Wikipedia, teamed up with individuals working at organizations like the Minority Media and Telecom Council and Rainbow Push Coalition to write an open letter opposing Donald Trump. You can find the full letter at Newsco Shift. Microsoft won a landmark appeal last week in a 3-0 decision in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in Manhattan. The Department of Justice was trying to get Microsoft to turn over customer emails stored outside the U.S., in Dublin to be exact. Why? Well, the DOJ said the Stored Communications Act authorizes it. But the court said, wait a minute, you mean that law written in 1986 when no one knew what the internet was? How could Congress have possibly envisioned email when it passed that bill? So the Second Circuit Court of Appeals struck down the lower court, which had initially ruled the DOJ could acquire the emails. Jonathan Stempel has the full story at Reuters. The feds made some big headway last week to open innovation and experimentation on a slice of spectrum that will facilitate the deployment of 5G, the fastest wireless broadband speeds we've ever had. The FCC passed rules last week for wireless carriers who want to use what's referred to as a 24 gigahertz band, making the U.S. the first country in the world to make that spectrum available. The White House also announced that it would be making a 7-year, $400 million investment for research into how we can get wireless broadband speeds to be 100 times faster than they are now. Check out Ingrid London's coverage in TechCrunch. The Chinese hacker who was convicted of stealing U.S. defense secrets from contractors and colluding to steal sensitive military data to help China's People's Liberation Army was sentenced last week to 4 years in prison. Beijing has denied the claims. Ian McCurdy has more coverage at CNN Money. Senator Al Franken is worried about the privacy risks of Pokemon Go, the hugely popular game so many of you have been playing. Apparently, the company that owns the game, Niantic, collects all kinds of data, and its terms of service even says it may share your data with third parties, including law enforcement. So Franken sent a letter to Niantic CEO John Hanke asking for more info on the game's privacy settings. Mazen Sadamet at The Guardian has more. Finally, a federal judge in the Federal District of New York has ruled law enforcement officers must obtain a warrant before using Stingray devices to pursue suspects. These devices enable the police to pinpoint a suspect's location by simulating a cell tower. Benjamin Weiser covered this story for the New York Times. Stay with us. For Washington Tech Policy Podcast listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You can listen at the gym, in the car, or on your morning run. How about Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World by Adam Grant and Sheryl Sandberg.
You'll see why it's so difficult for managers and test audiences to accurately evaluate new ideas, and how we can get better at deciding when to roll the dice.
You can download Originals free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at washingtech.com/book. My guest today is Matt Wood, Policy Director at Free Press. Matt helps shape Free Press's efforts to protect the open internet, prevent media concentration, promote affordable broadband deployment, and safeguard press freedom. He served as an expert witness before Congress on multiple occasions, and before joining Free Press, he worked at the public interest law firm Media Access Project and in the communications practice groups of two private law firms in Washington, D.C. Before that, he served as editor-in-chief for the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review, worked for PBS, and spent time at several professional and college radio and television stations. Matt earned his BA in Film Studies from Columbia and his JD from Harvard Law School. Please welcome Matt Wood. In a long-awaited decision, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the FCC's net neutrality rules. Net neutrality advocates breathed a collective sigh of relief when the decision came down, but the battle isn't over yet. And today we're going to look at the appeals process for this case and then turn to what other matters policymakers are keeping an eye on as they continue the fight to protect an open internet. So Matt Wood, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be here.
So tell us about the D.C. Court of Appeals decision and what they're likely and what telecommunications companies' likelihood of appeal is going to be.
Well, if you believe what they said the day of the case, some of them are thinking about it. I think AT&T had the clearest indication that they might look to take this either to the Supreme Court or to the entire D.C. Circuit. We don't know that they're going to. It doesn't seem likely that they're going to get rehearing from the full circuit. And it doesn't seem like a case especially likely to get Supreme Court review, especially with a diminished bench at the Supreme Court, where, if anything, conventional wisdom says they'll be even more selective and more careful. So it's just guesswork, of course. There's no predicting it in advance. If there were, then we'd know a lot more. But I think they'll make some noise about it. I think some people will probably appeal, but whether that'll be granted by the D.C. Circuit or by the Supreme Court is less certain. And then their chances of winning at either of those places, we think, are particularly low after the victory at the panel stage at the appeals court.
And what would the basis of their appeal be?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that points to why their chances are low. The Supreme Court, there's no single rule, but they tend to take up cases when there are a couple of different things, an undecided pressing federal question or constitutional question, but any matter of federal law, potentially. We don't really seem to have that here because, in large part, what the D.C. Circuit did was follow along the Supreme Court's earlier decision from a decade ago in the Brand X case from 2005. And so we can talk more about that. But, largely what this case does is follows that roadmap. And it's unlikely for the Supreme Court to say, we heard this a decade ago and we better hear it again now. Mm-hmm. The other thing that is more likely, at least, to trigger Supreme Court review is when there is a circuit split, and when you have two different courts of appeals coming to different conclusions based on the same question or largely the same question. We don't have that here either. It's just all been in the D.C. Circuit. I mean, way back in the early 2000s, it was the Ninth Circuit that got reversed in the Brand X case, but that's in some ways ancient history at this point. So it doesn't seem like it's going to get there, but again, that doesn't mean that certain carriers won't try.
And the Brand X case was the case that classified broadband as an information service.
Yeah, and importantly, not to quibble with the details, but because the details are so important, what the Brand X case did was it said the FCC has the discretion to make that classification decision. And so it's a Chevron deference case. If you have lawyers in the audience who are used to thinking about weird things like Chevron deference, we thought the FCC got it wrong back in 2005, but what that case said was it was the FCC's call to make. And a decade later, the FCC changed the outcome, but still is granted that discretion and that deference by the courts to be the ones who make that decision in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So what are some other ways by which telecom companies might attempt to circumvent the net neutrality rules? Have there been legislative attempts, new business models that have emerged? What are some of the more non-obvious tactics that advocates and policymakers ought to keep an eye on?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, the legislative attempts have been a little bit rote and a little bit silly, if you ask me, because it's not really been a full-fledged fight. I'm not complaining about that, but what it's been more is a series of the same tactics repeated again and again, much like a lot of issues now in this divided government we have, where the White House is in one party's hands and both chambers of Congress are in the other. Not a lot has gotten all the way through that process, and where a lot of these policy fights have gone, and by no means strictly FCC or net neutrality, but all sorts of fights about agency action have gone to the appropriations process. Congress hasn't really passed a budget in regular order in quite some time, several years, in fact, but they still go through the drill. And there are these riders, which some people have said are the modern earmarks. And instead of bringing money to my district as a congressperson, I'm going to try to legislate through the appropriations process. So long story short, we've seen several rounds of that last summer and now up through this summer, even though nothing got into the final appropriations bill that actually was passed last December. There were a couple riders in there that hit the FCC, but not on this issue. And in addition, there have been other bills moving through the typical committees, the Commerce committees in the Senate and the House that oversee the FCC, largely tracking what we've seen in the appropriations process. So, little shots here and there, attempts to defund the agency if it enforces any rules or if it does anything at all. Others that are a little more narrow than that. Some that really look to this court process. One of the riders that is in the current vehicle in Congress in the appropriations package is what we've called a legislative stay, basically saying the rules don't take effect until the court has its say. So that could continue to be pushed in conjunction with
the full panel.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Some people would say, well, look, the court process is over, and people in Congress who are pushing this provision could say, no, it's not. There's still a potential appeal to the full DC circuit or up to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So it's been a real grab bag. No unified single attack in Congress. And I think that speaks to the changing landscape over the last decade on this issue. The conversation has changed. The ISPs used to say it was a solution in search of a problem. And where they've been taken, I think, by the weight of millions of comments, mostly in favor, I would say overwhelmingly in favor of net neutrality. And by President Obama's statement is that today they say, typically, we're fine with the concept and even with some bright line rules. They just don't like the legal authority the FCC has used. That's where the Republicans in the House and Senate are as well. Certainly not happy about the legal authority, to put it mildly. But they tend to, even Mr. Walden and Upton, who run the Commerce Committee in the House, have said, we like net neutrality. We have a bill. We didn't think that bill was good enough, but that's kind of where we've gotten to, the place where people are forced to argue about how to do this and how to maintain some basic non-discrimination safeguards on the internet rather than whether to do it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things when I was an advocate that was a real sticking point with net neutrality was this disconnect between the groups that focus on minorities specifically and progressive groups. Their positions on net neutrality were vastly different, with minority groups, many of the minority groups here in the Beltway, taking the line of telecom companies, while the progressive groups were focused on promoting net neutrality policies. Can you speak to that conflict and where you see that conflict going now that the DC Circuit has made its decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think that conversation has changed somewhat too as the temperature of the overall conversation has gone down. I think there's always room for more cooperation and alliances there. And some of the groups, you said progressive groups, I don't really reject that label, but there are groups across the political spectrum, at least parts of the spectrum, that work on media and technology issues. And you're exactly right. Those groups have had different views on the tactics and even the substance of net neutrality from traditional civil rights groups over the last several years. I think that gap is narrowed, but I think the important thing going forward is not to necessarily paper over the differences of the past, but to understand where they were coming from. And, at Free Press, we try to work, and I hope we do work well, both on affordability and availability issues for broadband and on these non-discrimination principles. I guess where the substantive disagreement really boiled down to over the last decade is, are those two things a contradiction, or are they in fact consistent and both necessary? And we would say that the open internet is necessary, but so too is affordability and availability. It's not much use to people if it's open and free to those who have it, but you don't have it. So we definitely see the need to work on both of those. The FCC pivoted after doing net neutrality. One of its next big items was the Lifeline program, which is not a cure-all, but is a way to make sure that broadband is supported and subsidized for people with the lowest incomes in the country. And, unfortunately, all too often that overlaps with racial demographic groups as well. Mm-hmm. So, they're really, to us, the answer is all of the above. We want to have affordable internet, but we also want to have an open internet where nobody and no single company is exercising too much influence over what people can do with it. And we think it is essential that we work together with everybody to make sure that's a reality, not that we divide up into camps and act like those two things are, somehow a contradiction with each other.
Mm-hmm. So looking beyond net neutrality, what are some other policy issues advocates and others should be keeping an eye on? If you could prioritize the top three, what would they be?
A lot of them grow out of that same proceeding, at least in the broadband space. The FCC is busy with lots of other stuff too, on the cable TV and media ownership side. But flowing directly out of the net neutrality proceeding and really the legal authority, the reclassification of broadband as a telecom service, again, is this privacy proceeding that is going on now. It stems from Section 222 of the Communications Act, which won't mean a lot to a lot of people, understandably enough, but it's in the same area of the law that the net neutrality rules are grounded on.
And that's the common carrier?
Yeah, exactly. It's another extension of the traditional common carrier rules to broadband providers, and we think that that's the right way to do it, that broadband is a communication service and not essentially the same as a website. That was really the classification question in front of the commission over the last decade. So that's a big one now. That's in the comment phases. There's been arguments about that one too. People who have traditionally been opposed to net neutrality have tended to line up in opposition to this for some reasons that I would say are understandable, but certainly surmountable as well. There's been this notion that if you have broadband privacy rules that only apply to cable and phone companies, that's a problem. And I think Free Press and other privacy advocates would agree. There's plenty to worry about on a privacy score from edge companies, as we sometimes call them, Facebook or Google or any of the above. And pick your favorite big internet company. They know a lot about you too. But we've said the FCC has these laws on the books today, and they can enforce them and provide Americans and internet users in the country with more privacy than they have now. And that's why we've asked the FCC to go ahead and use that law rather than wait for a better one to come along. Another one, you asked for three, so I'd say privacy is one of them. I mentioned Lifeline. And really, that is, again, it's a great thing, switching the universal service program over to broadband. It's not a cure-all for everybody. Not everybody is eligible for Lifeline. It really is aimed at the bottom quintile or lower of incomes in the country. So that's, in some ways, the tip of the spear. The FCC needs to do more to lower prices for people across the board, no matter what their incomes may be. Mm-hmm. And we see them moving in that direction, not just with Lifeline and these other universal service subsidy programs, but with things like proceedings about how the companies wholesale capacity to each other. The awful FCC speak on this as something called special access, although they're trying to get away from that and refer to it more as business data services. But, in long story short, it's really about how the network holds together and when there's capacity available, is it actually available for competition and for individual users to use as they see fit? Or is it something that the biggest ISPs have the market power to parcel out on more monopolistic terms? And I think that's the classic definition of monopoly, even though I'm not an economist and shouldn't try to play one on radio, is that those companies can reduce output and still increase their revenues if they have true market power and control over the broadband infrastructure. And that's what we want the FCC to come at and to attack, really.
And what type of precedent do you think the D.C. Circuit's support of the FCC's net neutrality rules will have for pricing regulation?
Price regulation is difficult, and it's one of the things that has been debated in Congress. I try to walk a admittedly fine line here that might not seem like it's very important, but I think it is. We agree, we Free Press, that it's hard for the FCC to get it right if they're going to try to come in and, as a regulator, dictate the price, to literally set the price and say every month, Joe and Matt, you will pay $34.97 for your connection because that's what we figured out is the right price by looking at all the cost inputs. Now, I think that's very different from the power we think the FCC retains. And frankly, Chairman Wheeler got in trouble talking about this in Congress a few times, but eventually talked his way out of it and explained what he meant more clearly. The FCC should not be dictating prices today. Footnote, there are some markets where you might be able to say it is a monopoly. And so rate regulation questions are more relevant than when you arguably at least have competitive choices and some kind of competitive force to discipline the market. But I'll go back to my original and say the FCC shouldn't be dictating prices. That's just not where we are right now. They should have the power to look at rates, terms, and conditions on offer and decide if it's abusive. And, that's what we've asked the FCC to do in some cases is look at data caps and claims that are being made around them to see if they really are fair terms or if instead it's the company, promising you a discount and not actually saving you any money. Almost more of what in the Federal Trade Commission context is called unfair. The FCC has a different statute. I think it gives them a lot of the same powers, thankfully, because we want consumer watchdogs on the beat. But the FCC is empowered not to look necessarily for what's called unfair in Federal Trade Commission parlance, but for unjust and unreasonable terms and conditions in broadband carriers' contracts with their customers. So, that's a long answer. It's obviously a thorny legal issue. It's a political hot button, too. And as I mentioned, that's been in the appropriations fights and these other attacks and collateral attacks on net neutrality. But I try to tell congressional staffers when I talk to them, look, I know rate regulation is seen as a third rail in D.C. And seen as anti-business.
Right.
I doubt that your boss, your member of Congress, goes home to their district and hears from their constituents that the prices are too low.
Right.
People have a sense that, yes, broadband speeds have gotten better over the last decade. That's undeniable. But the prices haven't necessarily stayed where people want them and come down and made it more truly available to everybody. And so we need the FCC not to dictate prices, but to play a role in that conversation on behalf of users.
And can you speak to the zero rating issue? Can you describe what zero rating is for folks who don't know, and then kind of tell us, is Free Press participating in that? The FCC had said in its net neutrality rules that it would review zero rating practices on a case-by-case basis. So is Free Press participating in that? Does it think that there should be additional rules that regulate zero rating practices? What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and we are definitely participating. I don't know that there's any FCC proceeding going on at the moment, although they've certainly been asking questions. I think I can do it pretty simply. I mean, zero rating is the zero there is the price for a particular piece of data. So zero rated content is typically not charged to the user. And it doesn't even make sense if you have an unlimited plan, which some people still have on their wired broadband connections, and probably fewer people have on wireless, but they still exist. In that case, you pay a flat rate, and zero rating doesn't make a difference. This really comes into play when there is some kind of data cap or some other kind of usage-based billing model, or for a prepaid plan where you're always paying for a certain bucket of minutes and megabytes, perhaps. So some types of content wouldn't count against that cap. The carriers, the broadband providers, say that's a good thing for customers. A lot of net neutrality advocates would say it's obviously a bad thing. We have been, for better or worse, a little more nuanced and come up a little short of that. We certainly have concerns. I was talking a minute ago about whether the discounts that the carrier offers are real. that's exactly the kind of question we want to ask here. The usual claim is, well, somebody's got to pay for the data. And if the user is paying a monthly fee and then the website is paying a data charge, we think there's a lot of room in there for double recovery, for double charging by the ISP. So those are the kinds of questions we talk about with zero rating. We often look at the economics of it, not to say that the discriminatory impacts couldn't be there. I think it's obvious that they could be. If some people can afford to pay and others can't, from the website side, from the application side, the so-called sender, that could change which services people use. It's almost designed to do that. But there are different varieties of zero rating and enough different economic questions that we've been more in the tough question asking mode and not calling for the FCC to outright ban any and every form of zero rating right now. We just think there's more information to be gathered on the different types of plans out there. You have different offerings from T-Mobile and from AT&T and Verizon on the wireless side. AT&T Wired and Comcast have yet another variety that we think tends to favor their own video content. Mm-hmm. So, zero rating is a useful term. It's a good term in some ways once people get through the legalese and know what it means, but it doesn't really do justice to the variety and the differences between different types of zero rating plans.
Matt, it's been a privilege having you on the show, so thanks once again for joining me. I just want to ask you a few more questions, and then we'll close. Sound like a plan?
That's great.
All right. Go. On this podcast, we like to talk about policy and entrepreneurship, but also about what makes successful people like you tick. Tell us, Matt, what are some habits, tactics, and apps that you use every day to stay on top of your game?
Boy, habits, I don't know. I think in a job like mine, you have to enjoy catching a lot of different things. We're known for working on net neutrality, obviously, probably the main thing we're known for. But every time a new technology question pops up, I sometimes call them pop quizzes. People want to know, well, is this a net neutrality violation? Or how does this play out? Or I was just doing another interview and they said, predict the future for me here. So, I think you have to come to it with a certain degree of humility and certainly being humble about what you don't know, but that having the willingness and ability to put the pieces together in new ways is really the most important skill. I worked in law firms. That's when we first met, actually, is like when I was in a law firm. And that's much more of a, here's what you're going to do, go do it. It's not that it's non-entrepreneurial. I think people have to figure out how to work in that system and be entrepreneurial in big firms and how to be, in essence, your own small business within a much larger structure. Mm-hmm. But what I do now, and I'm lucky enough to do now, working in a nonprofit, is, there aren't quite as many rules of the road and superstructures. And so it is more, I think, entrepreneurial. From a policy standpoint, like what are we going to prioritize? How do we triage the situation? What are we actually going to try to hit back on? And what can we afford to let go? And so having that kind of flexibility and that real-time adaptability, I think, is the most important job skill. As far as apps and tools and techniques that are a little more technical, I don't know. I think everybody struggles with information overload. I don't think I or we have solved it yet. Things like Slack come along and people get excited about them. And I've looked at it and played with it and it looks interesting. Until we have one that replaces the flood of email that a lot of people still get, rather than just adding another channel to it. I'm going to remain a bit skeptical of the new communications tools, because when they're adding another layer instead of replacing one, I think it's just adding to that information flood. Mm-hmm. But that's really the daily challenge is, of those 200 to 500 to 1,000 emails or whatever people are getting, which are the ones that truly stand out that you have to drop everything for?
Very few.
Yeah.
But tell us the name of a book that you've read that you want to recommend to everybody. It doesn't have to be anything recent. It can be something, just your favorite book of all time. But what's that one book that you'd recommend to a mentee?
It's funny. I don't read enough anymore, I think, or at least don't read enough outside of the stuff that we are asked to read every day. So a court case pops out and 180 pages. There you go. That's not a short story. That's more of a novel.
Right.
So I don't know. It's funny when I think about it in a career setting. I can't even remember the names of some of the books I read before going to law school. There was one that was called 29 Reasons Not to Go to Law School, and it didn't work. I still went. So my advice from a lot of the books I read, I remember more nuggets of advice. One of the great ones, this was from some book that was probably written 100 years ago, if it was a day, that said, when you're a lawyer, when you're done talking, sit down.
Right.
Just this notion of, there's plenty to say, but know when to stop.
Right.
So for me, it's really more these one-liners that stick out from things that I've read. But I'll go back to 29 Reasons Not to Go to Law School. I'm sure it's been replaced by even more horror stories since then.
Right.
And I talk to a lot of law students because I go to conventions and conferences, and people always want to know, well, what's the one way to do it? Do I have to go to a law firm? Or the other side of the coin for people who want to work in nonprofit spaces, do I have to avoid law firms?
Right.
And this is going to sound like a terrible lawyerly answer, but I say there is no one right answer.
Right.
It has to be, people have to make their own way. And that's why I think your focus on entrepreneurship is exactly right. Wherever you're doing that, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, things change and people have to be willing to make those changes and to go along with them. And I think people who think there's one right way to do it are usually going to be disappointed.
Right. If we had the internet the way it is now, before I went to law school, there's no way I would have gone. There's so many opportunities now. This is just a great time.
Yeah.
But anyway, thanks, Matt, for joining me. Do you have any final ideas you'd like to leave with the audience before we close? And where can folks find you online?
So the organization is easy. That's freepress.net. I tend to say too much. I just talked about the value of knowing when to shut up. Well, I talk a lot on Twitter, and that's Matt F. Wood. With my middle initial stuck in there as a quicker route to just me, but I'd go to our website first. As far as final thoughts, something we didn't really touch on, I mentioned a bit, is the millions of comments about net neutrality. And Free Press is not the only group by any stretch, but we were one of the groups that founded this business model, if it's fair to call it that, of getting real people's voices, real internet users into the policy debates. Now, I won't deny that a lot of those millions of comments were pretty short and sometimes, from different templates, but it's a way for people to get their voice in the conversation, to make their voice and their vote count. Even though the FCC is not really sitting there counting votes, they take that public feedback. And that's really, I think, the true story of this net neutrality decision. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of legal background, a lot of legislative history, but it's also the story of people standing up and talking back to their legislators in ways that, a lot of groups across the political spectrum use today. It's by no means confined to one topic or one political viewpoint, but it really is about people having a bigger direct say in their government than ever would have been possible. You mentioned, if the internet were around as it is today, 10 or 15 years ago, I think this is a direct result of that too, is that kind of active role that people play in their government, even without having to get out into the streets, but when sitting at their computers and engaging with their lawmakers.
You've been listening to Matt Wood, Policy Director at Free Press. Matt helps shape Free Press's efforts to protect the open internet, prevent media concentration, promote affordable broadband deployment, and safeguard press freedom. Matt, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Joe. It was great to be here.
And that concludes episode 48 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. If you like what we do here, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment and head over to iTunes and give it a rating and review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and helps us out tremendously. Thanks again to all of you for listening, and I will see you back here next week.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.